The member for Fredericton South and leader of his party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to be able to rise to speak at second reading on Bill 11, an act to amend the Petroleum Products Pricing Act and General Regulation, which deals with the fuel charge that's become known as the carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting, just last week, Mr. Speaker, there were 200 youth out in front of the legislature on a climate strike. Left their schools, calling on this legislature and this government to take action on the climate emergency. And there were another 200 youth in Sackville the same day, Mr. Speaker, with the same message, that this is a climate emergency and that government and this legislature needs to take action. There were many, many youth as well in Moncton with the same message, Mr. Speaker, that they expect those in positions of leadership, those occupying seats in this legislative assembly, and those who have the honor to govern this province will take action on the climate emergency, Mr. Speaker. And they were part of a global, unprecedented climate strike by youth involving 1.5 million youth from around the globe, around the planet. Extraordinary. Something is happening, Mr. Speaker. They're fed up. And one of their messages, Mr. Speaker, is if we fail them now, we'll be dead, most of us, by the time this really causes grief for them and their families when they reach our ages. And that's a sobering fact, Mr. Speaker, a sobering fact. So, Mr. Speaker, it causes me considerable pain that this government is launching an advocacy campaign against action on climate change with public money online. Mr. Speaker, it's one thing for the government to decide to go to court. That's perfectly, within their purview, and if they believe that's in the best interest of New Brunswickers. I disagree. I think it's a waste of money. I think they're going to lose, but that's certainly part of their, their ability or their authority to do so. But, Mr. Speaker, this advocacy campaign is going to achieve what? Nothing. We're talking about a federal law that is bringing about the price on carbon for those provinces like New Brunswick who who haven't developed our own made in New Brunswick system. So it's a federal law. So the advocacy isn't going to change this federal law. The advocacy campaign smacks too much, Mr. Speaker, like a partisan effort to oppose the current party in power in Ottawa in the face of a federal election in October. It seems as transparent as that to me, because what other purpose is it designed to achieve? And it's misleading, Mr. Speaker. It's misleading. There's no mention in any of the so-called fact sheets about the fact that the carbon price will be refunded to New Brunswickers. No mention whatsoever. There's no mention of New Brunswick's made in New Brunswick climate target enshrined in our Climate Change Act to establish a carbon budget, a carbon footprint that we have committed to ensuring we get down to. No mention of that. Our target for 2030, Mr. Speaker, is 10.7 million tons of carbon in this province for 2030. That's 11 years away. Where are we at? Well, we're at, the most recent numbers we have are for 2016. We're at 15.3 million tons. So we've got 4.4 million tons, or to go. So we've got millions of tons to cut to reduce our carbon footprint, Mr. Speaker. So we need to get on with action rather than fighting action. We need to fight climate change, not fight solutions to climate change, Mr. Speaker. And the price on carbon, it's been such a diversion, but really, let's be truthful about it. The evidence is that it does have some impact, but not a great impact. That's the evidence. You look at the literature reviewing 30 jurisdictions, countries, and subnational jurisdictions who have a price on carbon, have had a price on carbon for many years, and you will see on average the impact is about 4% on carbon emissions, on carbon pollution. It's not great, but it's measurable. Now, the interesting thing is the average impact on industry in terms of their carbon pollution is much greater, 10% across those jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker. 10% reduction. Well, why is that? It's because industry is much more sensitive to the cost of their inputs than households are. So industry will respond to price signals, Mr. Speaker. And much of the progress that both the members from the Liberal and Tory parties here speak to on climate carbon pollution reduction in New Brunswick in the past was resulted from increasing prices, not government action, but the increasing costs of oil, Mr. Speaker, and the increasing costs of running the coal plant in Minto area, Mr. Speaker. So it's the increasing cost of producing power because of the market, Mr. Speaker, that caused those emissions to go down, because MB Power made the decision to save money. They would use their oil-fired plant in Coulson Cove less, and that they would stop using the oil-fired power plant in Dalhousie and the coal-fired plant in Grand Lake because of the price, because of the cost. The price signals were great. It's interesting to me, Mr. Speaker, that when the market causes prices to rise to the benefit of private companies, you don't hear any complaint. When gas prices go up, someone's benefiting from that, Mr. Speaker, but you have no complaint from the other side. But when a price is put on carbon for public policy purposes to serve the common good, then we hear screaming and yelling about this. So, Mr. Speaker, it's concerning to me that we're not making the progress we should be. We hear about progress, but that progress has been in the past. Since 2013, Mr. Speaker, here are our levels of carbon pollution, our emissions. 14.8 million tons in 2013, 14.4 million tons in 2014, 14.3 million tons in 2015, barely moving, 15.3 million tons in 2016. And next month, we'll get the numbers for 2017, and we'll see where we are. So we're not doing very well, Mr. Speaker, at all. The reality is we're going to have to get off fossil fuels over the next number of decades. That's what we have to do. We have to get off fossil fuels over the next number of decades to deal with this climate emergency. So how are we going to do that, Mr. Speaker? That's the question. Now, the government has set out in their fact sheets on the carbon price their plan. So they've got the Made in New Brunswick approach to regulating emissions, which is what they want to assign to the large industrial emitters, which really in New Brunswick amount to the biggest ones by far, ahead of anyone else. It's the Baldoon coal-fired power plant, around 3 million tons a year, and the Irving refinery somewhere in the same vicinity. And everything else pales in comparison to that from the industrial side. So it's really those two big sources, Mr. Speaker. And we've got a federal approach, a national approach to industrial emissions, which is quite weak, quite weak. It enables trade-exposed industries to pay anything from only price on carbon for only from 5 to 20% of their emissions. That's it, 5 to 20% of their emissions. And Mr. Speaker, the government now wants to bring in an even weaker standard for industrial emissions in New Brunswick. That's not helpful. Mr. Speaker, their plan suggests that there will be greater emphasis on renewable energy. I don't see it, Mr. Speaker. I didn't see anything in the budget about it. Nothing. If there was going to be something, you would think they would want to run it up the flagpole. Very popular. All the surveys that are done of New Brunswickers say 80% at least want to see way more renewable energy in our system, Mr. Speaker. St. John Energy did a survey of their customers very recently. Over 90% said, yes, we want to see renewable power in our system. So where's the plan? I don't see the plan. MB Power's plan that was essentially put in place because of Bernard Lord's government way back in 2003, that's the only plan on renewables we've really had, has reached its end, Mr. Speaker. It's reached its end, and there's so far, no plan to replace it. So that's why, Mr. Speaker, I will be bringing in a bill to propose a plan, at least, to expand renewable energy use and the renewable energy industry in New Brunswick, Mr. Speaker. So, similarly, their plans suggest a broad-based approach to energy efficiency, Mr. Speaker. I don't see it. There's nothing in the budget. It has something planned. You'd think they would run up the flagpole in the budget and celebrate it. Again, this is something extremely popular with New Brunswickers, with households, with businesses, with industry. Because why? Because it means substantially reducing their costs for energy. And you would think with a price on carbon, there would be a real focus on that because, of course, the less carbon you use, the less you pay. So, Mr. Speaker, there's nothing there so far. And we've lost the one agency we had in place to help New Brunswickers reduce their demand for energy and therefore their costs and therefore their carbon footprint and create jobs for upgrading their homes and their businesses, and that was Efficiency New Brunswick, Mr. Speaker, which was starved by the former Conservative government and killed off by the former Liberal government. Nothing in the budget about whether they're bringing that back. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't see a plan here at all, but I do see that our Made in New Brunswick targets mean we're going to have to find 4 million tons of reductions in carbon pollution in the next decade. And we've got to start now. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to see an implementation of the measures that the government says they've adopted, and those are the ones that were in the that are in the existing climate action plan. And actually, Mr. Speaker, given the most recent findings of the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change, it says we have 12 years to really get this turned around. I would say that those commitments and that strategy need to be not just implemented but strengthened, Mr. Speaker, so that MB Power, for example, as the Auditor General suggests, has a specific target to meet, which they don't. A specific target in terms of their carbon footprint, Mr. Speaker. That would be Made in New Brunswick, wouldn't it now? Like our Made in New Brunswick targets, which this government, in their fact sheets, in their public statements, continually ignore our Made in New Brunswick targets and talk about their Made in New Brunswick weak plan for reducing emissions from industry and their opposition to a price on carbon, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill is straightforward. It's simply dealing with the fact that there's federal legislation that is putting a price on carbon, Mr. Speaker, on those provinces that don't have their own price on carbon. When we forget in all this discussion that premiers all came together, and maybe this was the Prime Minister's mistake. Maybe the Prime Minister should have taken a harder approach and said, we're establishing national standards, we're establishing a national plan, we're going to do this and just go over the heads of the provinces. But that's not the approach he took, Mr. Speaker. That's the kind of approach his father would have taken, Mr. Speaker. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it would be better. Maybe not. But he took a different approach. He said, Mr. Speaker, he was going to work with all the provinces and come up with a national plan that all premiers bought into. Well, Mr. Speaker, that plan was established. It's the Pan-Canadian framework. And all premiers, including New Brunswick's premiers, signed on to it except for Saskatchewan's, Mr. Speaker. So there was this national plan. And it included a price on carbon, Mr. Speaker. And even the Select Committee, our own Select Committee on Climate Change, Mr. Speaker, that traveled the province to get people's views on climate action, Mr. Speaker, in its recommendation, it included the idea of a price on carbon as one of almost 100 recommendations. Just one. Many more, but just one. And that it be done in a particular way to ensure that it was effective without in any way being punitive, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, the Conservatives on that committee did not file a minority report. They did not file their opposition in the report to it. So there you go. It's in the strategy that the Premier says he now endorses. So this is a federal federal legislation. The agreement was made in the national plan among the provinces, among the premiers, was if a province doesn't do its own carbon price, then the federal government will put it in place. And we didn't do our own carbon price. The Liberals came up with a strategy, the former government came up with a strategy that from the very beginning I said, and I wasn't alone, was not going to be accepted. It didn't meet the straight-face test. In fact, I used those very words in this Legislative Assembly. So now, Mr. Speaker, while others put in place their own pricing mechanisms and came up with ways of reducing the impacts in their own provinces through negotiation with the federal government, we didn't do that. We didn't negotiate with the federal government. So this current government points to what PEI has and what Nova Scotia has and what Newfoundland and Labrador have. Well, Mr. Speaker, they all went to the table and negotiated with the federal government. And so Nova Scotia, which only has, their gas prices are going up 1 cent on April 1st. Why? They're getting the same level of carbon pricing as we are, but they're reducing their provincial excise tax, Mr. Speaker. That was negotiated. So that's where we are, Mr. Speaker. So this is really a housekeeping bill under the circumstances to put forward what's called a fuel charge, so that the fuel charge that's legislated nationally in federal legislation can be passed through without holding a hearing at the Energy and Utilities Board, which otherwise would be triggered. So it will be passed through just as taxes are on gasoline now. And as a housekeeping bill, Mr. Speaker, we'll certainly support that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.